Hi guys, this is CA Balakrishna. In this class, we'll quickly revise Essay 260 Communication with those charged with governance. Basically, a very small standard. Now, basically, this standard is effective from 1st April 2017. It was revised in 2017. Now, first of all, let us understand the basic difference between those charged with governance and management. Okay, how to identify who is management and who is those charged with governance. The basic difference is in the type of functions that they perform. Okay, auditor will be able to identify who is management and who is those charged with governance based on the type of functions that they perform. Okay, so first of all, we have to understand what are the functions performed by those charged with governance and what are the functions performed by management. If we understand these functions, we will be able to easily identify who is those charged with governance and who is management. Now, what are the functions that are performed by those charged with governance? Basically, those charged with governance is responsible for overseeing strategic direction and accountability of the entity. Basically, this is decision making function. Okay, decision making and overseeing function will be performed by those charged with governance. Example of those charged with governance would be audit committee. Okay, those charged with governance will be responsible for decision making and overseeing the strategic direction and accountability of the company. This is the function that is performed by those charged with governance. Okay, in the entity, the person who is performing this function will be known as those charged with governance. On the other hand, management will be responsible for executive responsibility to conduct entities operations. That means the decisions that are taken by those charged with governance will be executed by management. Okay, management is having execution function. Okay, example of management would be CFO. Now, it is not necessary that always there will be both management and those charged with governance exist in the management separately. Okay, in some type of entities, same person will be both those charged with governance and management. Example, let's say in case of some small partnership firms, okay, wherein owners, the partners will be both decision makers as well as they will be acting as management. Okay, thereby note, in some cases, management and those charged with governance can be same persons. Okay, hope this is clear. This is the basic difference between management and those charged with governance. Okay, auditor can identify who is management and who is those charged with governance in the entity based on the functions that they are performing. Okay, now first of all, let us see what will be dealt in this standard. Okay, basically, if you see the name of the standard, you will be able to understand that this will be dealing with some communications that has to be made by the auditor to those charged with governance. Okay, relating to those communications, this standard deals with three questions. The first question is whom to communicate. Okay, with whom the communication has to be made. That is the first question. Second question, what to communicate. Okay, what has to be communicated and how to communicate. This standard deals with these three questions. Now, starting with the first question, whom to communicate. Okay, the name of the standard itself specifies communication to those charged with governance. Thereby, as per SS 260, the communication has to be made with those charged with governance. Okay, the standard mandates communication to those charged with governance, and communication to management will however be made by the auditor. Okay, auditor will communicate all the matters to management. Apart from communicating to the management, there are certain aspects or the matters which are mandated by SA 260 which have to be communicated to those charged with governance. Okay, now let's say if all the persons, okay, if all the persons involved in the those charged with governance are also involved in managing the entity. Okay, all the persons who are involved in those charged with governance or also involved in management of the entity. In that case, there is no dual communication required. Okay, once the auditor communicates to the management, since management also involves all the persons involved in those charged with governance, the auditor again need not communicate to those charged with governance, because he has already communicated to the management, and management includes all those charged governance. Okay, all the persons who are involved in those charged governance are also part of managing the entity. In that case, auditor need not make dual communication. Hope this is clear. Okay, if all those charged with governance involved in managing the entity, then matters need not be communicated again to those charged with governance. Okay, communicating to management will be sufficient. Hope this is clear. Next, that is the first question, whom to communicate. Communication has to be made to those charged with governance. What to communicate? What are the matters that has to be communicated by the auditor? The first matter that has to be communicated by the auditor is auditor's responsibility. What is the responsibility of the auditor? His responsibility is to form and express opinion on the financial statements. Okay, the auditor has to communicate with those charged with governance that my responsibility is to form and express opinion on the financial statement. That's it. And audit does not relieve management or those charged with governance from their responsibilities. Let's say management has failed to comply with some of its responsibilities. Let's say, for example, as per SA 250, it is primary responsibility of the management to comply with all the laws and regulations. Now let's say management has failed to comply with some of the laws and regulations, and due to some inherent limitations, auditor was not in a position to identify those non-compliances, and the audit was completed and auditor has given audit report. Now, by the fact that audit has been completed and auditor was not able to identify some of the non-compliances of the laws, it doesn't relieve the management from complying with those laws. Hope this is clear. Okay, the fact that audit has been conducted does not relieve management or those charged with governance from their responsibilities. Okay, even this has to be communicated to the those charged with governance, saying that those charged with governance, once the audit has been completed, it doesn't mean that you are free from your responsibilities. Okay, this has to be communicated to those charged with governance. That is the first aspect. Next aspect that the auditor has to communicate, what is the planned scope and timing of the audit. Under this, auditor has to communicate how auditor has planned to address significant risk of material misstatement. Okay, auditor would have identified certain risk of material misstatement. Now, how the auditor is going to address this significant risk of material misstatement? Okay, what are the procedures that the auditor has planned? This has to be communicated to those charged with governance. And what is the approach that the auditor is going to take in relation to internal control deficiencies? Okay, and the application of concept of materiality. Okay, what is the amount of materiality that the auditor has determined? Okay, even this has to be communicated to those charged with governance. And how he is going to use the work of internal auditor. Okay, if the entity is also entity has also conducted internal audit, then how such the work of the internal auditor is planned by the external auditor to be used. Even this has to be communicated by the auditor to those charged with governance under planned scope and timing of the audit. Next aspect, significant findings during the audit. Okay, during the audit, the auditor might have encountered certain significant findings. Even those findings has to be communicated to those charged with governance. Under this, significant qualitative aspects relating to accounting policies. Okay, whether the accounting policies adopted by the management are apt to the situation or not. Okay, in case there are any deficiencies, how the suggestions that the auditor is making. Okay, this has to be communicated to those charged with governance. And whether the accounting estimates that have been taken by the management are correct or not, and whether all the financial disclosures that are made in the financial statements are adequate or not. Okay, this has to be communicated to those charged with governance. In case any additional financial disclosures are required to be made, even the same has to be communicated. Next, significant difficulties during the audit. While conducting the audit, the auditor might have encountered certain difficulties. Okay, even those difficulties has to be communicated to those charged with governance. What would be the difficulties? Delay in providing information. Okay, whether auditor has faced any delay from the management side in providing the information that has been asked by the auditor. If there is any such delay, he has to communicate the same to those charged with governance. Next, unexpected effort to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Okay, whether the auditor has put any unexpected effort for obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence, he has to communicate the same to those charged with governance. Next, unavailability of expected information. Okay, auditor has expected certain information to be present with the entity, but such information is not submitted to the auditor. Even the same has to be communicated to TCWG. Next, restrictions imposed by management. In case management has imposed any restrictions on the auditor, the same has to be communicated to those charged with governance. And unnecessary brief time to complete the audit. Okay, in case management forced the auditor to complete the audit within this time. Okay, if management has forced the auditor, then the auditor has to communicate the same to those charged with governance. Okay, next, still what has to be communicated? Unless all those charged with governance are involved in management, significant matters discussed with the management. Okay, in case the auditor has discussed any significant matters with the management, all those matters which have been discussed by the auditor with the management has to be communicated to those charged with governance. Okay, and in case auditor has requested any written representations from the management, the same has to be communicated even to those charged with governance. Now let's say in case all those charged with governance are involved in management also. Okay, in that case the auditor need not again communicate these matters to those charged with governance, because all the persons involved in those charged with governance are also part of management. Hope this is clear. Next, any other significant matter that in auditor's professional judgment are relevant to oversight of financial reporting process. Okay, if in the professional judgment of the auditor feels that any other matter is significant for the purpose of audit, the same has to be communicated to those charged with governance. Okay, those were the three aspects that has to be communicated. Coming to the fourth aspect, auditor's independence. See, auditor should also communicate to those charged with governance. Just a second. Yeah. See, auditor has should also communicate about his independence to those charged with governance. Okay, regarding independence, what are the matters that have to be communicated? Let us see. In case of a listed entity, auditor shall communicate a statement that engagement team, firm, and network firms complied with all the ethical requirements. Okay, auditor has to provide a statement to those charged with governance stating that all the engagement team and the firm and the network firms have complied with the ethical requirements relating to independence. Okay, such a statement has to be given. Next, all relationships and other matters between firm, network firm, and entity may reasonably thought to be bear on independence. That means, in case there is any previous relationship between entity and the firm of auditors, this relationship will not affect the independence of the auditor. Okay, this has to be confirmed. Okay, the same has to be communicated to those charged with governance. And related safeguards have been applied to eliminate threat of independence. Okay, in case there is any threat of independence identified, safeguards were implemented for avoiding the threat of independence on the part of auditor. Okay, the same has to be the safeguards that were implemented must be communicated to those charged with governance. Okay, we have discussed what are the matters to be communicated? There are 4 matters that are to be communicated. Okay, first one is auditor's responsibility, planned scope and timing of audit, significant findings during the audit, and auditor's independence. These 4 aspects has to be communicated to those charged with governance. Now, how to communicate? Basically, under how to communicate, there are 3 sub parts. One is form of communication, timing of communication, and checking whether the communications were adequate or not. Let us see. Form of communication. Basically, auditor has to make written communication in respect of significant findings and auditor independence. Okay, relating to these 2 aspects, auditor's independence and significant findings, these 2 must be mandatorily in writing, and other aspects can be either in oral or writing. Hope this is clear. Next, timing of communication. The auditor must communicate all these matters to those charged with governance on a timely basis. Okay, and start from time of engagement acceptance. Okay, basically auditor must start communicating these aspects to those charged with governance from the time he has accepted the engagement, and subsequently the periodicity shall be decided based on size and complexity of the entity. Okay, the periodicity within which the matters has to be communicated with those charged with governance has to be determined by the auditor based on size of the entity. Hope this is clear. Now, once these communications were made, auditor should also evaluate whether these communications are adequate or not. See, adequacy of communication process. Evaluate adequacy of two-way communication. Okay, two-way communication means once the auditor communicates, even those charged with governance has to reciprocate to the communications of the auditor. Only then it can be called as a effective two-way communication. If those charged with governance doesn't respond, then there will be no two-way communication. Thereby, auditor has to evaluate whether there is adequate two-way communication. If there is no adequate two-way communication, then evaluate effect on auditor's assessment of risk of material misstatement and take appropriate action. Okay, this has to be the action that the auditor has to take in case auditor feels that there is no effective two-way communication. Okay, by this essay 260 is completed.